What if the heart of the monarchy was betrayed not by a distant foe, but by the very Queen herself? The secret that King Charles uncovered didn't just shake his trust in Camilla, it threatened the very survival of the crown. For centuries, Britain's monarchy had weathered storms, wars, scandals, abdications, and the relentless scrutiny of a watching world. Yet nothing had ever struck so close. Nothing had cut so deep as the whispers that began to curl like smoke through the gilded corridors of Buckingham Palace. At first, they were only murmurs, stray conversations among staff, hushed voices speaking of intercepted communications, of strange phone calls that never should have happened. To many, these were nothing more than rumors, the kind of palace gossip that had always surrounded the royals. But for those who listened carefully, who pieced together fragments of truth from the shadows, the whispers formed something far more sinister, a portrait of betrayal that seemed unthinkable. For King Charles, the revelation came slowly, in fragments too painful to piece together. At first, he brushed them aside. After all, this was Camilla, the woman who had stood by him through decades of judgment and scandal, who had been crowned at his side in triumph and defiance. To suspect her was to doubt the very foundation of his private life. Yet, disbelief could only hold out for so long against evidence that grew heavier with each passing day. When the first reports were laid before him, classified documents, notes of intercepted communications, the careful handwriting of intelligence officers, it was as though the air itself left the room. His heart pounded with a mixture of anger and dread, for he knew that what he was seeing was not only a betrayal of their marriage, but of his throne, his people, and his sworn duty. The fury that rose within him was unlike anything he had ever known. Charles had endured ridicule from the press, the collapse of a marriage, and the constant comparisons to his late mother. But this cut deeper. The accusations did not belong to the realm of gossip or scandal. They carried the weight of treason, of secrets delivered into foreign hands by the very woman who should have been his confidant and ally. If true, it meant that the monarchy itself had been compromised at its core, its sanctity violated by the very queen consort who had promised loyalty not only to her husband, but to the crown. And so the betrayal was framed not as a private matter, of love gone astray, but as a constitutional disaster. This was no longer the story of a wounded husband. It was the crisis of a king whose sworn duty was to protect the sovereignty of the realm. The monarchy has survived wars and scandals, he thought bitterly as he stared at the damning documents. But never this. The words echoed like a prophecy. For Charles knew that what lay ahead was a reckoning greater than any his family had endured. Torn between devotion and duty, his heart ached with the weight of the choice he knew he must make. For in the end, the question was not only whether he could forgive Camilla, the greater question was whether he could forgive himself for allowing the monarchy to bleed from within. And though his heart still clung to memories of their shared past, of the bond they had built through storms of public opinion, his soul knew the truth. Love was nothing when weighed against loyalty to a nation. But how did a queen consort, trusted and crowned, descend into such treachery? The answer lies in a trail of secrets no one dared to expose until now. Behind the smiles at royal banquets and state ceremonies, Camilla was allegedly entangled in something darker, an underground web of spies who wanted the monarchy's secrets. To the outside world, she played the role of a queen consort with elegance and grace. But behind closed doors, intelligence officers began piecing together a puzzle that revealed a far more sinister portrait. The whispers of betrayal that once seemed like idle palace gossip now carried the weight of alarming proof. An anonymous report, slipped discreetly into the hands of Charles's closest advisors, described the unthinkable. Camilla, the queen, herself may have been compromised by foreign intelligence. The dossier contained fragments of intercepted communications, unexplained financial transactions, and detailed accounts of her private encounters with individuals who had long been on security watch lists. It began subtly, almost innocently. At state functions, foreign dignitaries would lavish Camilla with compliments, rare gifts, and whispered flattery designed to build trust. Most royals had faced this before, but what made Camilla's case different was the growing suspicion that she responded to these overtures with more than polite acknowledgement. Palace staff recalled moments that, at the time, seemed harmless. Camilla slipping away from dinners to take phone calls at odd hours, closed-door meetings where no attendants were permitted, conversations that ended abruptly when others entered the room. Only later did these fragments come together to reveal a chilling pattern. What looked like harmless exchanges were in fact calculated steps, each drawing her deeper into a network designed to exploit her position and access. The leaks began with small details that seemed trivial, information that appeared to carry little consequence. Schedules, travel plans, whispers of cabinet discussions overheard in corridors. But in the world of espionage, even the smallest disclosure can be weaponized. One slip becomes another, and before long, the trickle turns into a torrent. MI5 agents tasked with monitoring the situation grew increasingly alarmed. Reports suggested that information intended for the innermost circle of Britain's ruling body was finding its way into foreign hands. Allies began to express quiet unease. If the Queen Consort herself was a weak point in the nation's security, then the entire monarchy stood on perilous ground. For Charles, the thought was unbearable. The monarchy had long been a symbol of continuity, a fortress against the chaos of politics. But to imagine that fortress cracked open from within by the woman at his side was devastating. The intelligence services feared not only the content of what was shared, but the precedent it set. If the monarchy's secrets were for sale, what part of Britain's sovereignty could be considered safe? The palace became a place of shadows, where aides whispered of late-night cars pulling into side entrances and envelopes exchanged in silence. Some claimed to have heard fragments of conversations in Camilla's private chambers, voices speaking in tones too measured, too cautious, to be mere friendly discussions. It was as if Camilla was living two lives. By day, she smiled as the Queen Consort, standing beside Charles in public, representing the grandeur of the crown. By night, she allegedly became something far darker, a dealer of secrets, caught in the pull of a web that promised both influence and danger. The contrast was jarring, and it was this duplicity that horrified those who began to connect the dots. The monarchy was no longer facing external threats. It was bleeding from within. The question remained: who within the palace walls first uncovered this betrayal, and how did they dare bring it to the king himself? It wasn't a government official who first pieced the puzzle together. It was Charles's own sister, Princess Anne, who sensed something terribly wrong. Known for decades as the family's steel spine, Anne had never been one to overlook small details or excuse away inconsistencies. While others in the royal household dismissed whispers as paranoia, Anne's instinct told her that the danger was real. Her sharp eye caught what others had ignored, and her loyalty to both her brother and the monarchy would not allow her to stay silent. During council meetings, Anne began to notice something strange. Camilla often offered explanations that didn't quite fit, comments that contradicted previous statements, and subtle diversions whenever sensitive matters were raised. Where others chalked it up to nerves or misunderstanding, Anne saw a deeper inconsistency, a crack in the facade that hinted at hidden knowledge. Camilla's words carried a weight that didn't belong to her, as if she was echoing conversations not meant for her ears. To Anne, this wasn't just suspicious, it was alarming. But Anne knew she couldn't act recklessly. The stakes were too high, and the target of her suspicion was not only the Queen Consort, but her brother's wife. If she was wrong, she risked tearing the family apart forever. If she was right, silence could doom the monarchy itself. And so, she moved with the caution of a soldier, quietly gathering what she needed before confronting anyone. She reached out discreetly to staff members she trusted, long-serving aides who had witnessed unusual late-night visitors, secret phone calls, and unexplained absences. Their whispers confirmed her worst fears. Something was happening behind palace walls that defied every rule of royal protocol. Anne's investigation extended further still. Through discreet channels, she reached out to military contacts who had quietly flagged unusual leaks of information. Leaks that seemed to mirror topics Camilla had been privy to in private conversations. Bit by bit, the pieces aligned. Camilla wasn't merely careless. She was connected to something far darker. Each new fragment of evidence pressed heavier upon Anne's heart, until the truth became undeniable. She was no longer merely a sister, worried about her brother's marriage. She was the protector of the crown, standing alone in a battle no one else dared to fight. Yet beneath her iron resolve lay heartbreak. This was not an enemy across the sea or a faceless adversary. This was her own sister-in-law. The woman Charles had defended with everything he had. The woman the family had finally, reluctantly, accepted into the fold. To suspect her of treachery felt like betrayal in itself. But Anne's loyalty had never been to convenience. It had always been to truth. And if that truth cuts through family ties, then so be it. The monarchy had survived because someone was always willing to make the hardest choices. And now it was Anne's turn to bear that burden. Finally, she knew there was no turning back. She arranged a private meeting with Charles, away from prying eyes and palace walls heavy with echoes of gossip. With her evidence in hand and her voice steady but filled with sorrow, she laid bare the truth she had uncovered. The words struck Charles like lightning, tearing through the last remnants of denial he clung to. When Charles heard Anne's words, his world crumbled, and his next move would set the monarchy on fire. It happened in the dead of night. The king demanded answers from his queen. What followed was not a royal conversation. It was a clash that shattered their marriage forever. In the quiet halls of Clarence House, where tradition and secrecy often shielded the private lives of monarchs, Charles and Camilla faced one another without titles, without crowns, without pretense. It was no longer husband and wife, king and queen. It was the accuser and the accused. With shaking hands but an iron voice, Charles laid the evidence before her, documents marked with intelligence seals, transcripts of intercepted calls, and whispered reports from agents who risked everything to expose the truth. Each page was a dagger, each word a betrayal written in ink too dark to ignore. Camilla's reaction was as unpredictable as it was devastating. At first, she denied everything. Her words tumbled quickly, defiant, laced with disbelief. She accused Charles of falling victim to palace plots, of being manipulated by those who had never wanted her by his side. But, as the weight of the evidence grew heavier, pages scattered across the table, voices captured in transcripts that echoed like ghosts in the room, her defiance cracked. Anger surged in its place, sharp and biting, her voice rising with a fury born of desperation. She lashed out, accusing Charles of betrayal for believing in spies over his own wife, daring him to remember the decades they had fought to be together. Yet even in her rage, silence crept in. There were moments when her lips trembled, when her eyes darted downward, when words refused to come. That silence spoke louder than any denial, confirming what Charles had feared most. The emotional storm between them was relentless. Tears blurred fury, accusations collided with grief, and the walls that had once housed laughter now trembled with echoes of heartbreak. For Charles, every word felt like a knife twisting deeper. This was not only the destruction of trust between a man and his wife, it was the annihilation of a bond that had defied scandal, time, and tradition. And worse still, it was the realization that the betrayal went beyond the private sphere of marriage. It was a wound cut into the very flesh of the monarchy, a breach that threatened the stability of the realm itself. At last, his voice broke through the chaos, low, deliberate, and laced with a finality that chilled the air. "You are no longer fit to stand beside me." The words did not erupt in anger. They fell like a judgment, sharp and irreversible. At that moment, the queen consort ceased to be the partner of the king. She became a traitor in his eyes, one who could not be forgiven, one who could not remain in the shadows of power she had once shared. The sentence was not spoken in full, but its meaning was clear. This was not the end of a marriage. It was the end of Camilla's place in history as the rightful consort of a reigning king. But exile would not be decided in whispers. It required a council, a reckoning, and a decision that would echo through history. In a hidden chamber, the monarchy's survival hung in the balance. Should a queen be cast out for treason, or should her betrayal be buried to save the crown's image? The gravity of the decision weighed heavily on King Charles as he summoned his most trusted circle advisors, senior royals, and intelligence officers who understood that the future of the monarchy would be shaped by what was decided in that room. The air was thick with tension, for everyone present knew this was not about scandal alone. This was about the very soul of the institution, about whether the crown could survive a revelation so poisonous, or whether it would collapse under the weight of its own disgrace. The debates ignited like fire. Some argued for silence, for burying the truth deep beneath layers of secrecy. They reasoned that exposing Camilla's actions would rip open the monarchy to ridicule. weaken its standing with allies, and embolden its enemies. Better, they said, to craft a story of ill health or retreat, to quietly remove her from public view while sparing the crown's reputation. But others, fierce, unyielding, insisted that silence was as dangerous as treason itself. If the queen consort had indeed passed secrets into the hands of foreign powers, then allowing her to remain, even in silence, would mark the monarchy as complicit. The tension between concealment and confrontation crackled in the chamber, with every voice carrying both fear and urgency. Prince William sat at the heart of this storm, his face etched with torment. Torn between the love for his father and the complex bond he had tried to form with his stepmother. His silence spoke louder than words. He knew the damage her betrayal could do not only to the monarchy, but to the people's faith in the crown itself. And yet, he also understood what her removal would mean. Another fracture in a family already scarred by decades of loss, scandal, and division. His heart was divided, but the weight of his future kingship pressed heavily on his conscience. He could not shield her, not this time. Anne's voice, sharp and resolute, cut through the noise like a blade. She had no hesitation, no patience or half measures. She must go, she declared, her words ringing with the conviction of someone who had sacrificed too much to watch the monarchy fall from within. For Anne, the choice was clear. The safety of the crown came before sentiment, before family, before mercy. Her iron resolve silenced many of the arguments in the room, for she spoke the truth no one wanted to hear, but all knew was unavoidable. Yet the fear of scandal lingered, gnawing at the edges of every discussion. Advisors warned of headlines that could engulf the world, of allies turning cold, of enemies seizing the narrative to humiliate Britain on the global stage. But an even greater fear eclipsed these worries: foreign manipulation. If Camilla remained even hidden, even silenced, she could still be used, still be seen as a liability, still be a tool for those who had already exploited her once. The monarchy could not afford to live under that shadow. At last, after hours of bitter debate, the decision was reached. Camilla would not be imprisoned, nor publicly disgraced in a trial of treason. Instead, she would be exiled quietly, stripped of her position and power, removed from the circle of influence forever. It was a decision both merciful and ruthless, designed to protect the crown while ensuring she could never again pose a threat to its survival. But where could a disgraced queen be sent without igniting global fury and royal shame? The world would never be told the full truth. But inside palace walls, Camilla was stripped of her power, her titles, and her place in history. The decision had been made in secrecy, cloaked in silence, yet its execution carried the weight of 1,000 years of royal precedent. To the public, her absence would be explained as a private retreat, a time for rest and reflection away from the harsh spotlight of duty. But within the inner sanctum of the monarchy, those words were nothing more than a carefully woven veil, hiding the reality of an exile that would erase her presence from the throne she once shared. The orders themselves were chilling in their simplicity. King Charles, hand trembling yet steady with resolve, placed his signature on the final decree. It was not drafted as a royal edict to be displayed or celebrated. It was written in secrecy, delivered only to the most trusted of aides, designed to carry out the removal of a queen without leaving a trace of scandal behind. That single stroke of the pen severed Camilla from the role she had fought to claim. A silent execution of her queenship delivered not with a public spectacle, but with quiet finality. When word reached Camilla, her reaction was devastating. Those who were present spoke of tears streaming as aides entered her private chambers, tasked with removing her personal effects. The jewels, the gowns, the emblems of power, each piece carried away, as though they no longer belonged to her. She protested, begged for an audience, pleaded for the chance to explain. But the silence that answered her was absolute. No explanation, no confrontation, no last appeal, only the cold efficiency of a monarchy intent on protecting itself. For a woman once elevated as the queen consort, the suddenness of her fall was as brutal as it was absolute. The final walk was described as haunting. Camilla moved through the palace halls she had once commanded with pride, now reduced to a ghost, passing through corridors that no longer recognized her. Guards stood stiff, attendants lowered their eyes, and not a word was spoken as she departed. The The silence itself felt like judgment, louder than any condemnation that could have been uttered. The echo of her steps lingered long after she was gone, a reminder of how quickly power could be seized and how swiftly it could be stripped away. And then there was Charles watching from a window, unseen yet unable to look away. His heart ached with the weight of what he had done. This was not only the removal of his wife, but the end of a love story that had defied decades of scandal and resistance. He had fought for her, defended her against the world, and crowned her beside him. And now, with the stroke of a pen and the silence of a broken heart, he had cast her into exile. Love had been sacrificed on the altar of duty, and Charles was left to carry both the burden of his choice and the emptiness it created. To the public, the story was carefully crafted. Press releases spoke of a queen seeking solitude, of time, away from the throne for reflection and recovery. No mention of treason, no whisper of betrayal, no hint of the truth that had poisoned the monarchy from within. Yet behind the facade, the hidden reality was clear. Camilla had been banished, her name quietly removed from the seat of power, her legacy rewritten as though she had never been. But exile was not the end, for whispers of what Camilla had done soon began to seep into the outside world. Even the tightest palace walls cannot contain betrayal forever. Journalists began circling, and whispers of espionage erupted into dangerous rumors. For a brief moment, the carefully crafted narrative of Camilla's private retreat held. Official statements spoke vaguely of exhaustion, of health concerns, of a queen stepping away to focus on her well-being. But the press, seasoned by decades of royal cover-ups, was not so easily convinced. The timing was too sudden, the silence too complete, and the absence of images too conspicuous. To the media, the palace's explanation felt less like truth and more like smoke hiding a raging fire. Then came the coded hints, anonymous sources, some from within the palace itself. Others, with shadowy ties to intelligence circles, began feeding tabloids pieces of information too specific to ignore. Stories emerged of intercepted communications, of meetings with figures no queen should have entertained, of unexplained leaks of sensitive schedules. The details were vague, cloaked in careful language, but they pointed to a scandal far darker than ill health. Editors knew they were circling something explosive. Reporters sharpened their pens, determined to break the story that could redefine the monarchy forever. Public suspicion grew with each passing day. The people asked questions, and no press statement could silence them. Why had Camilla vanished overnight without a single farewell appearance? Why was the king somber and silent, his face hardened with strain in his rare outings? Why were William and Catherine taking on more public duties while avoiding mention of the queen consort altogether? The narrative of rest and retreat no longer satisfied a nation accustomed to transparency. The whispers of espionage, once confined to the corridors of intelligence, had escaped into the streets and living rooms of Britain. Behind the scenes, one palace insider made the fateful decision to risk everything. Whether out of loyalty to the truth or out of disgust at the deception, this individual confirmed what others had only hinted. Camilla had been accused of passing secrets into foreign hands. It was a revelation too dangerous to print outright, but its mere suggestion electrified the press. Editors chose their words carefully, cloaking allegations as unverified concerns, but the damage was done. The seed had been planted, and with it came the storm Charles feared most. Frantic, the king attempted to silence the growing speculation. Orders were given to halt stories, to lean on editors, to remind outlets of their duty to national stability. Legal teams drafted warnings, and courtiers scrambled to control the narrative. But the monarchy's efforts were like trying to dam a river already breaking its banks. Every attempt to suppress the truth only fueled the public's suspicion further. Each denial sounded less like reassurance and more like desperation. The monarchy was now balancing on a knife's edge. Too much truth, and the crown could be consumed by scandal. Too much silence, and the lies themselves would swallow it whole. It was a crisis no strategy could fully contain, for the betrayal at its heart was too shocking to be hidden forever. And yet, the public would demand answers, and Charles knew he could no longer hold the storm at bay. For the first time in centuries, a king confessed to his people. His own queen had betrayed the nation. It was not a moment of ceremony, nor a triumph of statecraft. It was an admission carved out of anguish, delivered by a man who had been forced to choose between love and duty. The world watched as King Charles took his place before the cameras, his posture upright, but his hands betraying a faint tremor. What had begun as whispers in palace corridors now erupted into history, carried into millions of homes by the glow of television screens. This was not a rumor anymore. It was the king himself, acknowledging the unthinkable that the queen consort had turned against the very institution she once embodied. Charles's voice wavered as he began, each word laced with the weight of sorrow. He spoke of loyalty broken, of trust shattered, of a grave betrayal that reached beyond marriage and pierced into the heart of the crown. He admitted to his people that the monarchy had been wounded from within, that secrets meant to protect. The nation had been compromised by the one person no one suspected. The moment was haunting. A king confessing not the sins of his people, but the sins of his own household. The cameras captured not a sovereign in strength, but a man visibly, aging before the eyes of the nation, burdened by a truth too heavy to bear in silence. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Across Britain, shock turned to sorrow, and sorrow to outrage. Some wept at the betrayal, mourning the collapse of the love story they had once reluctantly accepted. Others seethed with anger, demanding to know how such a breach could have been. Aloud, how the monarchy could have been so vulnerable. Newspapers rushed to publish special editions, while broadcasters interrupted programming to replay the king's every word. This was not merely a royal scandal. It was a national crisis, a moment that forced the public to confront the fragility of the institution they had assumed untouchable. At the king's side stood William and Kate, silent and stoic, their presence both symbolic and strategic. They were the faces of continuity, the embodiment of the monarchy's future, standing firm as Charles's voice faltered. William's eyes betrayed the torment of a son witnessing his father's pain, while Kate's composure reflected the quiet strength expected of a future queen. Their silence was deliberate, their restraint designed to remind the nation that even in the midst of betrayal, the monarchy's line endured. The toll on Charles was unmistakable. Those who watched noted how he seemed to have aged overnight, the fire of kingship dimmed by grief. His shoulders sagged, his voice cracked, and though he stood in royal attire, he appeared as a man broken, forced to expose to the world the darkest wound of his reign. This was not merely a confession, it was a surrender to truth, one that left him stripped of illusions and laid bare before his people. And yet, beneath the sorrow, his words carried a shadow of foreshadowing. This confession, he hinted, was not solely about Camilla. It was about the future of the monarchy itself, about whether it could withstand the betrayal of one of its own and emerge unbroken. It was a warning disguised as an admission, a message that though the crown had endured, its survival was no longer guaranteed. But even after confession, one question lingered in every heart. What would become of Camilla in exile, and would her shadow ever return? The monarchy survived, but it would never be the same. Camilla's betrayal carved scars that may never heal, and her exile remains one of the darkest chapters in royal history. Charles's reign, once envisioned as a chapter of renewal, became haunted by the shadow of heartbreak. Every speech, every appearance, carried the silent weight of the queen he had cast out. His crown remained intact, but his heart bore the fracture of a man who chose duty over love. In contrast, William and Catherine emerged as the monarchy's shield of hope. Their composure and unity became symbols of purity after scandal, a living reassurance that the line of succession was unshaken. The people turned to them as the embodiment of resilience, while Anne was immortalized as the steadfast protector of the crown, the sister who had seen clearly when others refused. Meanwhile, Camilla faded into silence. Exiled, erased from the throne she once occupied, her name became synonymous with betrayal. And yet, whispers persisted, rumors that she still carried secrets too dangerous to be buried, knowledge that could resurface at any moment. And so, the question remains, has Britain truly seen the last of its exiled queen? Or is the final act of betrayal still waiting in the shadows? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.